Hello, this is Sam Applegate from beadshop.com, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to make a bead weaving without the use of a beading loom. We're going to make it in the form of one of these bracelets with an adjustable sliding clasp. This project is going to take you about 4 to 6 hours to make the first bracelet, and then I would set aside a good weekend if you want to make any more, because as I'm going to explain to you, you can make up to 4 bracelets with one of your setups for this project. So the most important tool you'll need for this is one of our deep dish design trays with a velvet insert. I use a black one in the video, but you can use any color that you want. You're going to want a pair of thread snips, some Zap jewelry gel, which is a very strong glue for gluing our bracelet at the end, some size 10 beading needles, and also some big eye beading needles. And in addition to these supplies, there are a few things you'll want that we do not have for sale on beadshop.com. The first is some graph paper to graph out your pattern. Now I should say that all of the patterns we show in our samples on beadshop.com are available for free download on our project pages. However, if you want to create your own pattern, it's very easy to do so, and having some graph paper on hand will make this a simple process. You'll want a sharp pair of sewing scissors, a measuring tape, a straight edge ruler for tracing a line, and a fabric or chalk pencil. I use a graphite pencil in this video, but you're going to want something that will come off of your project easily. Now, when it comes to making the actual bracelet, the first thing you're going to start out with is some KO thread. And I'm showing an assortment of colors here. For my project, I decided to use the light gray. However, you can see when looking at the bracelet, it's not really apparent where the light gray thread is. The only place you can really see it is on the sides of the bracelet. So when you are picking out your color of KO thread, keep in mind that again, you can make 4 bracelets with one setup of the project. So you're going to want to pick a color that will match your 4 bracelets. But like I said, if you pick a neutral and put it in the bracelet, it's only going to show up on the sides. So it's not the most important color choice of your project. Next thing you will need is some 8/0 seed beads. I've used the galvanized silver, the matte canary yellow Picasso, and the seafoam green Picasso for this particular bracelet. You're also going to want some compassion suede, which we now sell on these wonderful little spools. We're really excited about this because it makes it very handy. And you're going to want some ultra suede. And both of these suedes are animal free, so they're a great vegan option for this project, in addition to the fact that you can stretch and cut holes in the suede and it's not going to break on you. It's really tough stuff. You're also going to need a spool of C-lon. This isn't visible in the project, it's just to hold part of it together, so the color of C-lon doesn't matter. And you're going to want some of our pewter transition beads, or whatever finish transition bead you want. That's a sliding crimp bead for leather. And some of our Pony Express beads in whatever finish you choose for the project. For mine, I chose the silver. You can see right here. So now that you have all of your supplies together, which are all available for purchase on beadshop.com, you're ready to get started on your bracelet. So we're going to start with our deep dish design tray and our KO thread, and what we're going to be doing is cutting our warp threads for the bead weaving project. And these are the vertical threads that lay across the board for you to weave your beads into them. And the way I like to cut my warp threads is I'll just wrap my KO around the board and make sure to leave enough headspace at the top, enough tail ends, for me to comfortably tie the KO onto the board. And the way I do that is just with a simple overhand knot. So I'll tie it once, and I like that knot to rest directly on the corner of the board. And then I'll double knot it. And I don't worry about it being too tight, because once it's double knotted, the nature of KO is that it's pretty waxy, and you can just tighten it up. And then you'll have this little guitar string sitting on your board. And so since I am doing a 9 bead wide bracelet, I'm going to need 10 warp threads. However wide your bracelet is, you're going to need the number of beads you have in your bracelet plus 1 for the warp threads. So in my case, it's going to be 10. And the nice thing about this project is you can have your bracelet as wide or as narrow as you want it to be. It's only determined by the number of threads that you put on the board. So I wanted to give you guys a close-up view of what's happening with the knot when I tie it. So, like I said before, you really want to make sure that this knot rests on the edge of the board, that corner. It just makes it easier to tighten. And don't worry so much about these other tail ends. I know I'm getting them kind of tangled up. They're not going to matter at this point in time. But I tie the one knot. You can see it gets a little bit loose. I tie the second knot, and then I can just yank down on it and it'll tighten up to be as tight as I need it to be. So now you can see that I have all 10 of my warp threads strung up on the board. And like I was saying before, you want them taut like guitar strings. They should have a little spring in them, but you don't want them so taut that you feel like they're gonna snap if you move them on the board. They should have a little bit of give to them. Like I was saying earlier, we have these little tails up at the top. They really shouldn't get in your way, but if you feel like they're a little bit messy, what I like to do is take a piece of Scotch tape and tape them to the side of the board so that they're just out of your way and you don't have to deal with them anymore. So before we start our actual bead weaving, we need to talk a little bit about pattern. This is the sample that I'm going to be making during this video, and as you can see, I use 3 different colors of 8/0 seed beads. I use the Seafoam Green Picasso, the Canary Matte Yellow Picasso, and the Galvanized Silver. And the easiest way I have found to make a seed bead weaving pattern is by using graph paper, where each little square equals 1 bead. If you like any of the samples that we show on beadshop.com, you can feel free to download the free pattern from any of the project pages. But if you want to go ahead and explore on your own, you can definitely make your own pattern just using some colored pencils and coloring in the same width as your bracelet. And just as a reminder, my bracelet is 9 beads wide, which is about 3/4 of an inch wide. And when determining the length of your bracelet, it will be 8 seed beads to an inch. So now we're ready to get started on our project. The first thing I'm going to do is take my seed beads and pour them out onto my design tray into little piles. You can use a beading triangle for this project or another vessel to hold your beads, but I like to just directly take them from the design tray insert. The velvet of the board makes it really easy to pick the beads up with your seed bead needle. So I think that it's a little bit easier than using something like the beaded triangle. So I like to keep everything in little separate piles. As long as you're not moving your tray around too much, you're not going to have a hard time with your beads getting mixed up. So now I take my size 10 seed bead needles and I'm going to thread onto it 2 yards of KO. I've already done this. And this is what's going to create your weft, which is the thread that you weave through horizontally. And I use 2 yards. That's not quite enough to complete 1 bracelet. But if you use any more than that, it's going to get really unruly. So I like to just add extra thread into my project, which I will teach you how to do later, and it's really easy. So now we're ready to start our bead weaving. I'm going to take my KO thread, and I'm going to take the longer tail end, and all I'm going to do is tie an overhand knot with it and tie it to this left hand warp string. So you can see I just tie 1 knot, and I like to double knot mine just to make sure. And you can see I leave a tail of about 2 to 3 inches over here on the left. We're going to deal with that later, but that's all you need to do to get started on your weaving. So I'm going to take my needle, and I like to put my thread all on the left-hand side so it doesn't get tangled. And I'm going to pick up the first row of my pattern. So that's 1 silver bead. Then I'm going to take 7 of the Seafoam Green. 5, 6, 7. And 1 more silver bead. You can see how easy it is for me to pick up the beads on the design tray insert. So you can see my pattern, and I'm going to take and put the needle underneath the warp threads, and I'm going to put each bead in between one of the threads. So I'm going to push them up through that space between the warp threads, put my finger up, and you can see that there's a space for every bead. And my weaving's a little bit wider than my beads are right now. When I pull the thread tight here, it's going to compress everything to the right size. So I just pulled my thread underneath. And the next step is I'm going to take my beading needle and I'm going to put it back through the beads, but I'm going to go over these warp threads on the inside of the beads. So what I like to do is take my beading needle and point it up so it's scraping the top, the inside top of the beads. See, when I let go, the bead weaving is holding up because I have a thread going underneath and then a thread going over, so the beads are going to kind of float in between those spaces in the warp threads. Then I'm going to take and pull the thread tight. When I pull it tight, it's going to compress the weaving to the right size. And it's just as simple as that. So I'm going to pick up the next row in my pattern. So it's one turquoise, or seafoam green, excuse me, then one silver, then 5 more seafoam, then one more silver, then another seafoam. Really easy to pick up the beads this way. Now I can put them underneath the thread and push them up. I like to keep my finger there to make sure that the beads don't fall back through. It just makes it easier. But when you let go, they're going to stay there most of the time because of all the tension you have on your warp threads. Then again, I put the beading needle back through, scraping the inside top of the beads. Pull my thread through. I can use my needle to straighten my weaving a little bit. The beads will move a little bit. The more rows you have, the more stationary your weaving will be. And as you can see, it's really easy to move them and fix any little bumps or imperfections you may have. So the next row of my pattern, 2 seafoam, 1 silver, 3 more seafoam, 1 silver, 2 more seafoam. Put it underneath the weaving. Push my beads up through. Pull my KO through. And go back through over the warp threads. So really setting up this project takes quite a bit more effort, I think, than the actual weaving part. It's really easy once you get going. You just need to make sure that you're following your pattern. So when I put my beads through, I like to look and make sure. You can see the chevron starting to form, so that's the right pattern. I can pull it through and go back through over the top. Really simple. So now I only have about a foot of KO thread left. So I'm going to teach you how to add some new KO so we can continue our bead weaving project. What I'm going to do is weave my end back up through the weaving that I've already done. So I'm going to go back through the second to last row. Doesn't really matter if you're going over or under any warp threads right now. You're just worried about weaving your weft back in so it is stable and you can add some new thread. So I'm going to go back up 4 rows, and as soon as I'm done with that, I'm going to take my bead snips and just snip that end off as close to the edge as I can. You can see I have a little tail left over, and that's okay. Usually when you take your weaving off of the loom, because it's so flexible, that little end will pull itself back through a little bit without pulling your end all the way out the 4 rows. If they're still sticking out at the end, you can always take your thread snips and cut a little bit closer. Just make sure not to cut any of your warp threads or your weaving is going to fall apart. So now I've taken my KO and cut myself another 2 yards for continuing in my bead weaving, and I've threaded it onto the needle. And what I'm going to do is weave it back through the bracelet, much like I just did to end the last piece of KO. So instead of going back through the fourth piece, which I just ended in the fourth row. I'm going to go back through the third row, which is just below where I just ended. I'm going to pull my KO through until I have a tail that is, again, about 3 inches long, like it was at the beginning. Then I'm going to go back through the second row, pull it all the way through. Make sure not to pull on my KO through. You want that tail to stay there. And I'm going to go back through the first row. And I'm going to end up where I just left off with that last short piece. And if I yank on this, it's not going to come out really. And then I'm just going to continue my weaving where I left off. And once I've woven a few rows of the beads, it's definitely going to be secure, and you're not going to need to worry about this KO pulling out. And you can cut that tail off, or you can wait until the end. But just make sure you weave a few more rows to make sure that it's really woven in there. It's the beauty of this project. When you need to add new thread, you don't need to worry about tying any new knots. You just weave a little bit back through, and you go for it. I'm going to beat that back up. And here I'm going to add another row, another stripe of the yellow beads, as you can see I did up here. So instead of starting another blue chevron, I'll start a yellow one. And another thing I want to teach you is how we take out a row if we find that we've made a mistake in our weaving. So right here, I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to forget my silver bead. So I'm going to put on 3 yellow beads instead. Forget another silver bead too, just to make it really obvious. As you can see right now, my pattern isn't what it's supposed to be. It kind of looks like it is, but instead of a silver, I put 2 yellow beads through. But let's pretend I didn't notice. It could be hard to miss if you're kind of in the flow of things. Pull the thread through. And then, oh no, my pattern isn't right. So the easiest way I found to go back through, it's really hard to weave your needle back through. Sometimes you catch a thread and it's really hard to get it untangled. So I like to take my KO thread off of my needle, and I will pull this last thread so you get a little loop at the end where your KO was. You can just stick your needle in and pull it all out. And then your beads will just fall down. You can pull them all out. Then all you have to do is thread your KO back onto your needle and start all over again. So now I am done with my bracelet. I'm making mine for a 6-inch wrist, so it's always good to be measuring as you go. You can't take this project off the board to try it on, so it's good to have a little tape measure. And since I'm adding another inch in the ultra suede for the end tips, that's going to make it 6 1/4 inches long, which I like because that means I have a little bit of breathing room on my bracelet. So now I'm going to take my tail end of KO and do the same thing I just showed you when adding a new thread and weave it back into the bracelet just to make sure that it's secure. And another way you can do this is at the end I like to go back through an extra row and then stick my needle coming out through the middle of the bracelet. That way, when I snip it off, that end is extra protected because it's in the center of the bracelet. So now you're going to do the same thing with this little tail end at the beginning. I would recommend leaving a little bit more space than I did. Maybe add a couple extra inches to this so you can weave it in a few more times. But it's not going to matter as much with this end since you tied it to the warp threads at the beginning of the bracelet. So the integrity of the bracelet's not really compromised at this point. You're just getting rid of that little end thread. So I'm just going to go back through 1.5 times with this piece. And then I'm going to snip it. And now you have a finished bracelet and you're ready to start working on getting it off the board. So now that you have your ends woven back into the bracelet, we're going to take a new type of cord to create what we call sheeting at either end of the bracelet, at the top and bottom. And this is going to keep the beads from moving on the warp and give you a point to put your ultra suede on. And I like to use a thicker thread than the KO. This is our C-lon. It doesn't matter what color you use because it's going to be covered up anyway. So I just picked another neutral gray to match my light gray KO thread. You're going to need only about 20 inches of this, so not very much. Take my handy bead snips, or thread snips, excuse me. And the C-lon is a bit too thick to fit through the same needle we were using for the bead weaving. So I'm going to use one of our big eye needles. These needles are great because they open up in the middle. If I can show you, there we go. And have this really big eye, so they're really easy to thread. I don't like to use them for the bead weaving because they're a little bit flimsier and they make it a little hard to weave with the beads on them, but they're great for this part of the project. So you just stick your thread through and you're ready to go. So now that you have your C-lon threaded under your needle, we're going to start weaving the C-lon into the ends of the bracelet to create the sheeting. So this is a simple plain weave where you just go over one thread and under the next, over and under. It's kind of like when you made pot holders at camp. You're just going to go all the way across your bracelet. Pull it until there's a little tail left at the end, and you're just going to leave that there. Doesn't matter right now. Then you're going to go back the other direction, opposite. So this last thread on the right hand side, I went under last. I'm going to go over it now. Go under the next one. And just continue on. Sometimes you might need to push and pull the bracelet a little bit. And when I pull this one through this time, I'm going to pull it a little tight. I'm going to push these down so they're compact, and I'm going to just start to pull these ends in a little bit so they're going to angle in, not this dramatically, but you want it to not be the same width as the bracelet, just a little bit narrower so that you can put the ultra suede over it and it won't stick out from the sides of it. It just makes it a little bit easier this way when you pull it tight. So this time through I'm going to pull it tight again, slide my threads down, and I'm going to keep going and doing this for about 3/8 of an inch. You want it a little bit less than 1/2 inch long, because that's how long your end is going to be. Your the end of the bracelet with the compassion suede, I mean. You can see I'm still pulling it in a little bit tighter. I can pull that in even a little bit more. We'll do one more. And you're just going to keep going like that till you're about 3/8 of an inch in. So I finished weaving in my C-lon about 3/8 of an inch, and now I'm ready to bind it with my Zap glue. Now this is very fast drying, strong jewelry glue, and we use it to just kind of cement these threads together so that you'll have something for your ultra suede to grip to once you're putting it on the bracelet. And it also means that the beads and the thread can't slide up and down on the warp if you were to move your bracelet. So, has this nice, easy applicator tip. And I would not recommend touching the Zap glue while you do this because it can glue your fingers together. You can get them apart, but it's just not recommended. Not what I would recommend. And I'm just going to put a thin coating on, just all around. Try not to get any on your beads. Use your applicator tip to do this, and then you're gonna let it dry. And it takes about 24 hours to cure. I would leave it be for about a half hour before you decide to move your bracelet. So you can cut that end off. And now you're gonna go to the bottom of the bracelet and do the same thing. Weave 3/8 of an inch of the C-lon in and zap glue it. And about a half hour after it's dry, you can slide the warp up and down on your board like I'm about to show you. So before you put the sheeting on the bottom of your bracelet, I want to talk a little bit about how to get your bracelet to lie flat. As you can see, the beads can move around a fair amount. They can pull apart or they can scrunch up together. And if your bracelet is too tight like this, it's going to buckle when you take it off the loom. So before I put on my sheeting, I like to just take a quick second and run my finger under the bracelet a few times. And if I see any particular problem spots, kind of smush them out so that the beads are spaced evenly. And then when I weave my sheeting on at the bottom, I make sure not to push it up too tight and cause it to buckle again. So now that my bracelet is completed, I have all this extra warp thread at the bottom and I could start weaving another bracelet. And with a board like this, you can get 4 bracelets out of it, and you want to make sure that you can use all of your warp effectively if you really want to get that many bracelets out. So I'm going to teach you how to move the bracelet up the board. So you're going to want to make sure that you take the tape off if you had taped on your tails at all, and you're just going to grasp it by the KO thread and kind of lift it up a little bit and push it forward off the board. And you'll have to lift it up a little bit. It usually goes pretty smoothly. But as soon as you do that, your bracelet will be underneath the board. You can kind of respace your KO thread for your next bracelet and keep going. You can see it on the back of the board. It's just fine. Since you have glued these ends down, the bracelet's not going to move or skew too much anywhere that you don't want it to go. Once you cut it off the board, it's going to stay exactly where you wanted it to be. So now I've cut my bracelet off of the board, and I cut mine right above where I tied all of the knots in my warp thread at the top of my board. It's kind of hard to tell with this mess of cords, but that's where I cut it off. And then I have a bunch of empty warp after it because I didn't weave any extra bracelets. So if you had decided to do that, I would recommend leaving an inch to inch and a half to 2 inches between each bracelet so you have enough room for sheeting. And then once you have woven everything, put your sheeting in, and all of the glue has dried, you can cut your warp off between any of the bracelets, and you're going to be just fine because they're not going to move around. They're all set on the KO thread, and then after they're off the loom, you can cut each of the bracelets apart. So I'm going to clean mine up a little bit right now. I don't need any of this extra thread anymore, so I'm going to cut off this KO thread pretty close to my sheeting right there. And I'm going to do the same on this end. So now everything's all cleaned up, and I can snip these little ends off as well. To get my bracelet ready to put the finishing touches on it. So now I'm going to start putting the endings on my bracelet, and with what I used for that is some ultra suede, and I picked mine in the chamois color. And for the ends, I want to put a 1/2 inch finish on each end. So that means I'm going to cut little squares that are the width of the bracelet, which is 3/4 of an inch by 1 inch, because I'm going to fold them in half, and that'll give me a 1/2 inch at the end. So I am going to take I have here a little ruler straight edge, and I'm just going to measure out 3/4 of an inch on here. And I like to actually go 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch over 3/4 of an inch so that you have a little bit of breathing room on the edge of the bracelet. And I would recommend using a fabric pencil for this part of the project. I'm using graphite right now so that you can see it a little bit better in the video. Fabric pencil didn't show up so well. But I find the easiest way to do this is to just make a strip as wide as you want. Then you're going to take some sharp sewing scissors and cut as straight of a line as you possibly can. So there I have a strip that is a little bit wider than 3/4 of an inch. So you can see if I put my bracelet on the end, it's going to cover that end up nicely. And now I'm just going to measure 2 pieces out that are 1 inch long. So I'm going to take the inch markings are on the other side. Oh, I'm going to measure 1 inch, another inch, do the same on the other side. Measure 1 inch, and another inch. And then I'm just going to cut my ultra suede out. And now I have 2 little squares for my ending finish. Since I use graphite, I'll just fold these to the middle so you can't see the pencil marks. But if you're using a fabric pencil or a piece of chalk, you'll be able to just wipe that off. So the next step for this is to take my compassion suede. We now have it on these nice little spools, very handy. And for the end of my bracelet, I'm going to cut a good 6 inches or so. That's way more than you'll need, but you want to make sure that you have enough. And I'm also going to want to cut a little hole out in the middle of each of these so that the compassion suede can fit through. And the nice thing about this ultra suede and the compassion suede, it's man-made, it's not real leather. So you can stretch it, you can cut a hole in it, and it won't erode away. Cutting a hole in it isn't going to make anything fray, it's not going to mess anything up for you. So what I like to do is fold it in half and make a little, actually you can use your ruler again, so you can figure out where the middle of your bracelet is. Just put a little dot there. And then I like to fold it in half longwise and just make a tiny, tiny cut. I might need to go. So I have a little hole in my suede right there that is just about the right size to pull my compassion suede through. So just like that. I'm going to pull it through almost all the way. You can see it sticking through in this end. And then what I'm going to do is take my bracelet, give you a better shot of this, and I'm going to first glue down that bottom side, get it lined up. So I will take my trusty Zap glue and I like to put it on the bracelet again. Remember, this stuff dries very fast and it can glue your fingers together. So at this point in time, I like to be pretty careful about not touching anything with the glue on it, and just make sure it's lined up really nice for you. If you just push it down, it should stay. You can flip it back over. Then apply a little bit more glue. You want to get all the middle of the bracelet. Make sure that that compassion suede is going to be glued to the ultra suede, so I always make sure to put quite a bit there. Use your applicator tip to spread it around. Then I'm going to fold this over to evenly match that side of the bracelet. And you have a completed first side of your bracelet. So now that I've completed the ultra suede and compassion suede ends to my bracelet, all I have left to do is add a sliding clasp to it. And the easiest way to do this is to fold your bracelet in half so that the compassion suede can match up with itself and not twist over. Might be nice to cut them to the same length here to make it a little bit easier. There we go. Took a few tries for me apparently. And you're just going to pinch them together and put one of these transition beads on. This is the transition in pewter. It's a crimp bead for leather. And it is the perfect size for the fitting 2 strands of compassion suede. So all you have to do is feed it through. You don't need to open the crimp or close it after you're done. You just slide it on. And as you can see, none of my ends are twisted, which is nice. So I'm going to pull it all the way on evenly so that now I can work with these ends of the bracelet. And what I'm going to do is put 2 of these little pony beads on. They're called the Pony Express. These are in the silver. So I'm going to thread 1 on to my bracelet. And I want my ends to not be too long, so I'm going to look for about that long of an end. And all I'm going to do to secure the bead is tie a knot. And I'm not going to tie it all the way tight. I'm going to kind of keep it loose so I can move it up and down to the length I want it to be. I think that looks about right. And before I cinch it down, I'm going to take my Zap glue again. And I'm just going to put a tiny dab of glue in the knot so that when I tighten it down, we're not worried about it coming out. And then your bead's just going to rest there. So I'm going to do that with the other end. Tie a loose knot. And try to make it, I want mine to be the same length. You could definitely have ends to your bracelet that are different lengths if you wanted. Mine might end up being a little bit longer than the other one, which is okay by me. Just gonna cinch it down, hold the beads down, and then you just trim. I'm going to use my sharp sewing scissors for this actually. The thread snips don't really want to cut the compassion suede. And now you have a completed bracelet, and this bead will just slide down for you. You can slip it over your wrist and pull both ends of the bracelet, and you are all done. So thank you so much for watching our video on how to do a bead weaving bracelet using just your design board. You can find all of the supplies and patterns on our website, beadshop.com. Thank you.